Okay, welcome everyone to this seminar in contemporary Marxist theory. Is an event co-organized with the research seminar of the European and International Studies Department. And we are very excited to have a panel, which is really a tricontinental panel with the speakers based in the United States and China, and also Europe. And as you know, of course, this is a book discussion of the book Trade Wars are Class Wars by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis. Of course, this book advances quite a provocative and innovative view of the trade wars as a conflict in the last instance between classes. And what we thought we could do as a seminar in contemporary Marxist theory in collaboration with that department was to investigate more this argument with a group of scholars who, of course, are experts on both China, the United States, and also on the class struggle in both countries. So we're very excited to be here. With me, Inga Rademacher, who is the convener of the EIS seminar, will say a few words about the speakers, and Björk Lidin, who is a PhD student in our department who has studied these issues as well, will help me moderate along with John Narayan, who is doing the recording right now. So welcome everyone. Inga, if you would like to introduce the speakers, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucia. We're thrilled to have this amazing panel. Matthew Klein has written as a commentator on the global political economy for over a decade, writing for The Economist, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and Barron's. And he now runs Overshoot, a subscription research service tracking the global economy. Discussing his book will be the political economist Cui Zhiyuan, who is a professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University. He is a leading member of the New Left and works on alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. Additionally, we have two specialists in the workers' movements in China and the US. Professor Ngai at Lingnan University, Hong Kong, publishes extensively in top-tier journals and is the winner of the 2006 C. Wright Mills Award for her book, Made in China, Women Factory Workers in a Global Workspace, published in Yale University Press. Kim Moody is a visiting scholar at the University of Westminster and writes on labor, social movements, and the revitalization of rank-and-file unionism. He has authored several books on trade unions in the international economy, and the latest one is Trans and Trade Union Travelers, Internal Migration and Organized Labor in Gilded Age America 1870 to 1900, and this book was published in Haymarket Books.
Thank you so much. So Matthew would be our first speaker. We agreed that each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. I will let you know when your time is coming to an end, maybe with a reminder. Thanks so much, Matthew, please.
Thank you, first of all, very much for inviting me. It's great. This book came out over a year ago, and it's great that people are still talking about it and interested in it. So it's really, really appreciate having the chance to address this group of people. I hope you all find it useful. As was said in the introduction, the basic argument of this book is that a lot of what we see in the world is a misinterpretation of economic conflicts between classes across countries, and that those conflicts are being interpreted wrongly as conflicts between countries that have competing national interests or maybe incompatible national characters. And we framed the book, we cover a lot of area, but I mean, really focused in particular on sort of three major economies, the US, China, and Europe. And, I think one of the things that's really helpful for looking through this is that because it's a counterintuitive argument, it helps, I think, to realize that it's not actually a new one. We're really updating arguments that were made over 100 years ago by people like John Hobson and John Maynard Keynes. And those arguments were made about the world to analyze the world of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and then sort of people just forgot about them because it didn't seem to really matter after World War II for a long time. But it turns out that a lot of those dynamics actually have become increasingly relevant, particularly since sort of the 1980s. And what we're really doing is updating them and really providing kind of context and historical awareness, and along with sort of modern economic data approaches for looking at it in sort of the major economies. And the basic argument works like this, which is that if all income and all spending in the world are always equal, which is just true by definition, it has to be the case. You can't earn income unless someone is spending money somewhere else, and you can't spend money unless you have it somewhere. Globally, all spending has to come from income somewhere. But those differences, in the individual entity, whether it's a country or a person or a business, that income and spending don't have to match. In fact, they generally don't. And either it's because you're saving, you're accumulating financial assets, or you're borrowing, you're selling financial assets. Maybe you're in retirement and you're winding down a stock of you're winding down the things that you've saved over the course of your life, or you're borrowing to buy a house, or if you're a company, to invest. Either way, those things don't add up. And so the key point here is that the behavior of individuals in different entities, it tends to be systematically different, so that most individuals over the course of their life, maybe not at any point in time, over the course of their life, will generally spend what they earn. Maybe you save more when you're working, you spend down in retirement, but generally your savings rate over the course of your life is close to zero. It's not true, though, for people at the very top of the income distribution. And the reason is because there's just only so much that you can buy, only so much you can spend on goods and services, even if you have very expensive tastes. So if you're part of the very, very small group of people that's taking in tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, you're going to be taking a lot of that money and then using it to purchase assets, whether it's real estate or predominantly financial assets. Same thing with companies. Companies, with their savings is actually profits, right? And profits, those that you can return them to shareholders as dividends, but if you don't, you have to do something with them. You could buy back your debt, you could buy back your stock, or you buy for other financial assets. We've seen this particularly since 2000. A lot of major companies have been just accumulating cash and actually lending elsewhere, either lending to governments, or they even sometimes they're buying mortgages. And so what all of this means is that if you have shifts in the distribution of income, whether it's changes between which individuals are earning income or changes between workers and businesses, you can have systematic shifts in saving behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that saving for the world as a whole is going to change, but it does mean that there has to be some sort of offsetting force. And a lot of what happens is that either you have just lower spending because incomes go down, or you have higher borrowing. And this is, again, something that people have seen repeatedly in the past. You saw it in the period of imperialism that John Hobson was writing about, high imperialism. A lot of times you actually have the advanced, Western European economies essentially using gunboat diplomacy to encourage their dependencies to borrow as sort of a way of recycling the surplus capital that their own, manufacturing owners are generating. And you saw it more recently in the past few decades, where you have situations where effectively, this is true in the United States, it's true in Europe, it's true globally. You have either the rich or companies they control, or in the case of China, which is obviously a different but in many ways similar situation, the government and government-controlled entities lending to poor middle-class households to consume, because that's the only way that the numbers can add up. Essentially, you can't increase profits as a business by cutting your costs. An individual business can, but businesses as a whole cannot, because their costs generate income for others. So the only way you can actually increase profits as a business is if you cut your costs, is if other people borrow to make up the difference. And that creates, that can be sustainable depending on who's doing the borrowing, but it can also be very destabilizing. This was written about, people talk about it in the roots of the Great Depression as another, these are one of the sort of the main factors. And so this is really the sort of framework we bring to looking at the global economy of the past few decades. And a lot of the book is either providing the sort of broader theoretical and historical background, or really focusing specifically on the experiences of the past several decades, in particular looking at, in many ways, how 1989 was a sort of a hinge year that, for very different reasons, I would say, because very different things happened in those places, but both in Europe and in China, you have significant changes in the domestic political economy that then end up creating, imbalances, as we call them, where production systematically exceeds consumption, particularly in Germany and in China. In the situation in Europe, it sort of extends from Germany to the rest of Europe after the Euro crisis, and that these imbalances between production and consumption have to be absorbed somewhere else. And that's not exclusively, but it is predominantly the United States that ends up absorbing these this excess production, and it does it in two ways. One is essentially underproducing at home, and so one of the things we've seen in the United States, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is really since 2000 in particular, sort of a deindustrialization in the sense of persistently low utilization of existing manufacturing capacity, large-scale job losses, large-scale disinvestment in manufacturing capacity at a time when demand for manufactured goods continue to rise. And so you have a situation where even though US consumer spending in the US does not rise particularly quickly after 2000, because income and production rise unusually slowly, you have a big increase in the trade deficit over that period. And that leads to a lot of destabilizing effects economically and politically, which we've seen. The flip side of this is that you have other places in the world, particularly Germany and China, although certainly not exclusive of them. Those are the ones we focus on because they're sort of archetypical of sort of among the major economies, why they, the places that evolve in this way, but they're not unique. Is a situation where people end up effectively living below their means, where workers in particular are deprived of fair compensation for the value of what they produce, and instead you have outsized profits going to companies and those who control those companies. And so it ends up being a situation where most people in all of these societies are worse off, maybe for different reasons, but they're all worse off. And then the elites in all across these societies end up being better off. Some of this, you could say, was sort of done as sort of a deliberate act of collusion, in the sense of, for example, we know that the owners of Western manufacturing enterprises, whether it's in the US or Europe, often invested in China specifically because they knew that labor and environmental standards were lower and that they could increase their profits that way. But some of it was not. Some of it was due to sort of internal dynamics within China in terms of the own development priorities of the government and the Communist Party, and that ended up having knock-on effects for people within China and, as a consequence, for people in the rest of the world. And a lot of, as I said, a lot of what we're trying to do in the book is explain these links and how a lot of what we might think of as sort of domestic, internal political economy decisions have profound consequences, or can have profound consequences, for people in the rest of the world, and tying it to, as I said, these historical contexts. So I know we said 15 minutes, but I could ramble, but that is sort of the main thesis of the book, and I like to have more discussion. So happy to move on to the next presenter.
That's great. Thanks so much, Matthew. So our next speaker is Cui, if I pronounce correctly. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's my great pleasure and honor to participate in this Marxism seminar in KCL, and especially gave me pleasure to meet, to see Matthew. Because last year when the book just came out, I invited your co-author, Michael Pettis, to my class. And as maybe many of you in this seminar know, Michael Pettis has been living in Beijing for more than 20 years. And he owned a very famous musical band. But he told me, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19, his music club has to be closed. Anyway, so I prepared a simple PowerPoint. Maybe I can share the screen.
Yes, sure. You should be able to share your screen. Yes.
Yes. Can you see it? No.
No, you should just open the PowerPoint window. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can. Yes, you can maybe
great.
do the fuller.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, good. Let me see, how do I? Okay. So. Well, sorry about this. How do I? Okay. So first, as I would like to say, I very much agree with the main thesis of the book. Namely, this rising inequality within countries heightens trade conflict between them. So problems of past few decades do not have their roots in geopolitical conflict or incompatible national characters. Rather, they have been caused by massive transfers of income to the rich and the companies they control. So also the book is very, very fun to read. I just give one example. I didn't know before reading the book that actually the container shipping, was first fully developed during the Vietnam War. And the US Army hired Michael McLean, the original innovator of container shipping, the 集装箱, to build and operate a container at this bay in Vietnam. Of course, this container shipping is without today's global value chain, which China benefit from it a great deal, cannot be working. And another interesting story is that about Apple's Zhengzhou factory in China. So the book vividly described that this so-called this bonded zone lets Apple buy the finished phones from Foxconn, this Taiwanese company, before they have technically entered China. So the Foxconn assemble Apple phone in Zhengzhou, China, however, without legally enter China, and they sell those phones to subsidiaries of Apple, usually based in place like Ireland, which is tax haven. And so this book is full of these very, very illuminating stories. So I highly recommend the book for everyone if you haven't already read it. However, I have some thoughts I want to discuss with all of you on the explanatory framework of the book. So it is oversimplification, but I hope it is a fair summary to say that the book is a combination, the book's explanatory framework is a combination of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke's saving glut theory and the early 20th century British economist John A. Hobson's theory of underconsumption and imperialism. A fascinating combination indeed. But however, I have some thought on each of these two parts. So first look at Bernanke's saving glut theory. He first proposed it in the 2005, but then during the crisis in the New York Times Review, December 25, he makes it very explicit that, so this highlight the Mr. Bernanke said he regretted that more was not done to regulate financial institutions and mortgage providers, which might have prevented the flood of investment, including that from China, from being so badly used. But the Fed's role in regulation is limited to banks, and the strict regulation by itself would not have been enough, he insisted. So basically, Bernanke blamed the subprime crisis in US on flood of Chinese savings into the US. And he said this could be regulated better, but by itself, the regulation is not enough. So it's very, very explicit explanation. This Chinese saving glut causing the financial crisis in the US. But I think it's interesting to note that the saving glut theory is challenged by Adam Tooze implicitly, not very explicitly, in Crash. And I think interesting to note that Crash also win Gabriel Prize because trade wars, class wars win. Congratulations to win, has already won the Gabriel Prize 2021. And the Crash win, I think it's 2019, because published 1 year earlier. The Adam Tooze emphasized that he emphasized based on this study done by economist Claudio Borio and Pettis from in Basel, International Bank of Settlement, they found that in 2007, roughly twice as much money flowed from the UK to the United States as from China. And also, they found that from this gross flow of cross-border capitals, Adam Tooze emphasized that Ben Bernanke's saving glut all pointed the finger in that direction, namely this Chinese saving glut. But if we map not annual flows, but cross-border banking claims, this gives further proof of how one-sided Sino-American view of the build-up to the crisis was. But I think Adam Tooze implies a critique of saving glut theory, but he didn't make it explicit. However, in the Economics magazine, November 28, 2020, explicitly criticized Bernanke's saving glut theory. And they based on this criticism on a paper by the Bank of England economist, Mr. Kumhoff and his co-authors. So basically, this very, they say it's not basically not a saving glut, but a credit glut or banking glut. And the reason seems to be very simple, very intuitive. They say the abundance of lending by American banks to the country's citizens. In spending this fresh money, Americans would no doubt suck in goods from abroad. This lead other countries to increase their savings, since Americans cannot import goods that are being consumed or invested elsewhere. But in this case, the increase in foreign savings and the surplus is a side effect of a financial boom within America, not a cause of his overspending. But how to judge these two alternative explanations? One is the saving glut, another is the credit glut or banking glut. Personally, I think Michael Kumhoff and his co-author in Bank of England is more in the spirit of Keynes, because Keynes, according to James Mead, who was a young colleague of James Mead, a young colleague of Keynes when Keynes wrote General Theory in 1936. Mead summarized Keynes' revolution as that Keynes' intellectual revolution was to shift the economist from thinking normally in terms of a model of reality in which a dog called saving wagged his tail labeled investment, to thinking in terms of a model in which dog called investment wagged his tail labeled saving. In other words, in Keynes' theory is different from traditional theory, that it is the investment cause the saving rather than saving cause investment. And Robert Skidevsky, who wrote 3 volumes biography of Keynes, in another recent book called Money and Government, very simply put, the saving is simply a decision not to consume. It is not a decision to invest. Investment is not financed by saving. It is financed by bank credit. That there cannot be any direct connection between gross capital flows and the current account imbalance. Therefore, between current account imbalance and the financial meltdown of 2007 and 2008. So based on this Keynes theory, which gave priority in causal relation to investment. So from the saving, actually it cannot be the main explanation of this view. And then I move to the second thought on the part of relying on Hobson. And there are interesting section in the book titled "Everything is Old is New Again," and basically because they argue that this basically is because extremely unequal income distribution within the rich countries makes they have to look for export or foreign investment, and this so-called underconsumption theory, even though has many valid points, however, Keynes criticized Hobson in his general theory in chapter 22 and 23. And but he said practically only differ from those schools of thought, thinking that they may lay a little too much emphasis on increased consumption at a time when there is still much social advantage to obtain from increased investment. But more theoretically, he thinks there is both consumption and the investment should be increased if possible. So his view is that the wisest course is to advance on both fronts at once. So I think unless we believe in Larry Summers' secular stagnation theory, saying that there is no profitable investment opportunity, no, which I don't believe, because if we think about Green New Deal, there's many profitable investment opportunities, no. So this Keynes' notion of we should try to expand both consumption and investment, I think is relevant. And so I want to conclude by saying that even though the book relies on Hobbes' theory of underconsumption and imperialism, which should be applauded, we should, especially in the Marxist seminar, we should support this effort. However, I personally think there is another theory of imperialism, which based on Rudolf Hilferding, who was 2 times Minister of Finance in the Weimar Germany, and he was later killed by Nazis when he escaped with Hannah Arendt, crossed the border from France to Spain, but was not successful as Hannah Arendt and was captured by Nazis and was killed. And but Rudolf Hilferding especially emphasized that he thinks the underconsumption or overproduction is just a kind of normal, situation in the capitalist production. By itself, he said, underconsumption tells us very little, and he therefore proceeded to examine more specific course suggested by Marx in the 2nd volume of The Capital, which is the disproportionality which arises between capital good and consumer good in industries. I will finish. Just know. So I just happy to want to show that I think not widely known today is that Hilferding, Rosenberg, and Kautsky, because Kautsky was usually considered a traitor, but actually these 3 of them all together belong to the so-called 2.5 International. So 2.5 International try to make search for alternative both from the 2nd International and the 3rd International. So it's very interesting. I think this trade war and class war should inspire us to search maybe 2.5 International today. But last slide is to say, I want to say without if we disagree with saving glut, we can still explore the link between inequality and the crisis. And here I think the Rajan, the former governor of Indian Central Bank, made some interesting observation. He thinks that America's growing inequality and the thin social safety net created a tremendous political pressure to encourage easy credit and keep job creation robust, no matter what consequence to the economy's long-term health, where the US financial sector with its good incentive is the crucial but unstable link between the overstimulated America and the under-consuming world. So this inequality make it easy credit become a perverse incentive in the US financial and political system. And so just by conclude saying that, so this I think it means even if we drop the saving glut theory, we can still explore the link between inequality and the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Luo Poon from Hong Kong. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, Sister Lin Chen and Alice, to invite me to be one of the discussants here. And I'm so happy to see old friends and new friends here. And obviously, I would like to thank you, Lucia and Inga, for the very kind introduction of me. So let me try to express some of my viewpoints. I read this book obviously with great excitement, and obviously I'm going to assign this book to all of my students. But I have to say that the scope of this book is bigger than I can comprehend because of my limited training, and I have a little bit training in labor study and classic political economy, but I almost have no training in trade or finance areas. So it must be the sister Lin Chen, good intention to invite me to be one of the discussion of this book, so that I could learn from this very important angle in order to understand the global imbalance and also its impact on the working class all over the world. So my feedback could only reflect my limitation as well as my potential misunderstanding. But I try to constrain the potential mistake. So I limit myself to the discussion and also the prescription of the two authors provided to China, at the context of the Sino-USA trade war. So obviously, I entirely agree that trade wars are class wars, which generate rising global inequality and huge imbalance of the wealth between a global elite class of ultra-riches and the working class comprised of global South and global North, who suffer seriously due to the global imbalance. While I entirely agree, this understanding, I would understand class wars are still more than trade wars, which class wars are caused by economic systems bigger and tougher than the problem caused by trade and finance. Those issues mentioned in this book. Class wars in China and also between USA and China, to my limited understanding, is caused by a kind of variegated forms of capitalism, which I try to conceptualize it as infrastructure capitalism, in the current form. So I would try to say that those forms of capitalism generate crises that I'm afraid that is beyond the prescription of these books could offer. But I would say that I really appreciate the prescriptions of the two authors provided to China. So having said that, I still would like to discuss 4 of them. So the first prescription the two authors provided to China is that the hukou system should be reformed and eventually eliminated so that all Chinese people can gain access to the social welfare and benefits. To me, it looks a little bit too late now because the hukou system has already turned into a class issue, automatically cemented rural migrant workers on the one class and also the elite and middle class on the other. So even though I have observed that the hukou system has been reformed in some of the cities and towns in Guangdong and maybe beyond Guangdong as well, but it didn't really help to raise the wage levels in those cities, nor the consumer power of the working class. So while the migrant children are allowed to enter public schools, provided that their parents can provide evidence of joining the social insurance systems via the employment or self-employment. The wage, however, the wage of the migrant workers they earn, they are not really enough to support the whole family's expenditure in the cities, including the very basic survival costs of shelters and meals. Food is definitely not an issue in China at the moment, but the costs of the shelter and the daily necessities, such as buying herbs or medicines in the community medical stores, are very high. So without the hukou system, the migrant neighbors, they are still the migrant neighbors, situating at the very lowest class in the society. So the hukou systems once subsidized the labor costs in both production and social reproduction spheres and contributed to the world workshop of China has led to the emergence of a class system, which cannot be really eliminated by eliminating the hukou system. So this is my first comment. My second feedback to the second prescription provided by the authors is that the government should expand the quality of its safety nets and guarantee reasonable income security in the retirement, including healthcare. Obviously, I would appreciate this prescription as well. To be fair, the Chinese government did expand the quality of the safety network and some income security, including the retirement security, particularly for the urban elites and employers who have a regular work contract. However, for the emerging 80 millions of the platform workers who are never provided with a labor contract, they are still barred from the safety nets, not to mention the income security when they're retired. My persistent concern is always the construction workers in China. Another 40 million of them who never have a work contract, who are getting older and older, and who are extremely in need of support. But the payment delay, the wage delay issue is getting worse than before, due to the government's financial deficits on the infrastructure project and also the current private property sector's crisis. So working to get earning is the heaven's way. I mean, in Chinese, we call it tian dao. So the aged construction workers, we say, working to get earning is the heaven's way. But working to get earning is getting more and more difficult. My research team have working very hard. I should say that. I mean, we use almost more than 10 years' time to push for realizing the Chinese labor law, which means that only provide a legal contract to the construction workers so that they can receive certain kind of safety nets. But all those attempts proved quite futile. So the research team finally turned to provide grant and community service to the workers until all these attempts were barred and under pressure to stop the services. So this experience lead me to comment on the third and fourth prescriptions provided in this book. The third and the fourth one, I try to recommend that the Chinese government should make it easier for workers to organize and negotiate better pay and labor conditions. And the state-owned enterprises should pay higher dividends. Again, I say I appreciate those prescriptions. Obviously, the state-owned enterprises should turn the agency workers. I mean, most of the state-owned enterprises in China, they employ 70 agency workers. So, I mean, the easier prescription may be to turn those agency workers into regular workers. However, due to the contradictions between private and state capital, I mean, I never see this tendency to improve the working condition of the agency workers employed in the state enterprises. I mean, I didn't really do a lot of research in the state-owned enterprises research, but we did really a lot, I mean, and in the private and also the foreign-owned enterprises, especially in Shenzhen and in Guangdong. So my biggest headache is the Jetset struggle, I mean, in 2018. I mean, in which the university students try to support the workers in Shenzhen to set up a formal trade union inside a company. But all of these students, they were all arrested. So this incident further confirms that class wars have to be resolved by class struggle in whatever innovative form they are. And if those innovative forms couldn't touch the real issue of class, the transfer of wealth from the ultra-rich to the ordinary household could be an empty slogan. And I'm not quite sure that we still have the very classic choices between reform or revolution. If no genuine reform are taken, and if the door of deepening reform is closed, then the option is again socialism or barbarism. Well, I'm a labor scholar, but today I speak from the position of Hong Kong. So I just would like to try to say that the extradition law, I mean, originally target the ultra-rich and the capital flows from mainland China via Hong Kong to the US and Europe, but then end up dramatically in crashing the whole civil society in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government arrested more than 10,000 Hong Kong protesters since 2019. The arrest of these people, these protesters, didn't really resolve the rising class inequality issues, as said by the two authors in this book. Not to mention that the interest of the elite class has been affected. A very clear indication is that the property market prices almost have no decline since 2019 movement and the COVID situation. While the quarantine policy caused sudden closure of the economic activities in the town, resulting in unemployment and underemployment. So this current situation. So we have a vision and practice that embrace the future, but also connect with history, calling for direction and experience that could enrich the struggles of workers of the whole world. Rosa Luxemburg once said, before a revolution happens, it is perceived as impossible. But after it happens, it is seen as having been inevitable. So obviously to her, it is not true that communism will arise automatically from the daily struggle of the working class. True socialism will be the consequence of firstly, the growing contradiction of capitalist economy, and secondly, the comprehension of the working class of the unavoidable of the subtraction of these contradictions. This is what we could create a social transformation. And obviously to me, today, the struggle of global proletariats is facing an even more complicated world in which capital and state have monopolized information technology, automation, and artificial technology for their own use, resulting in further colonizing of human life and surveillance of political actions. Workers of the world unite is the only way and possibly way to prevent the slide into chaos and catastrophe that Rosa Luxemburg once when she posed the choice between socialism and barbarism. So maybe I stop here and you can continue to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in the spirit of Workers of the World Unite, our next speaker is Kim Moody, who will talk about the labor movement in the United States. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, and thank the organizers of the panel. Thank the panelists. This is a great deal to think about. And the authors of the book also. Very challenging book indeed, and I certainly agree with the basic proposition, and I think that it's so important in this period when in fact, as the book points out, and as all the panelists have pointed out, that the rulers of our nations are doing everything possible to direct our anger and our dissatisfaction towards each other instead of towards them. And so I'd like to pick up, I guess where Ngai left off, Workers of the World Unite, and all of that. I'm going to focus on the US, and I'm going to do something a little different, I guess, from the other panelists, which is to talk about the tools, the weapons that American capital in particular, although I think many of you will recognize these as global trends as well, American capital have used against the working people and the population of the United States in general. We have to put this in a framework of not only international conflict, which they would like to stir up, but also racism at home, that the international economy is at home in the United States in the form of immigration as well as imports and all of that. And so this attempt by governments and capital to deflect our views away from them, I think, is important, and the book makes a contribution, an original contribution to that. I have some slightly different ways of looking at things, but I still think it's important. So yes, trade wars are class wars. I think that one of the things I want to say that perhaps Matthew might disagree with, but is that in looking at this in the US, it isn't just Trump. You look at the Biden administration, it's also into stirring up anti-Chinese sentiment and so forth. And it isn't even just, unfortunately, the powers that be. If you look at the trade union leadership in the United States, they too are often willing to turn to the question of trade, of imports, or of the offshoring of production and so forth as the culprit, when the real culprit is the behavior, both global and domestic, of capital itself. And I think this is important. One of the things I've tried to point out in a number of articles and in some of my books about more recent time, the book that was mentioned is actually about over 100 years ago, but most of my work is about more recent time, is that if you look at what destroyed manufacturing jobs, let's take the proposition that the main reason for the decline of unions in the United States, aside from labor law and all the well-known things and the actions of capital itself, has been the massive loss of manufacturing jobs. And of course, international trade plays a role in this. I'm not going to deny that. But if you look at what actually destroyed the millions of jobs that disappeared in the neoliberal era, since basically the early 80s up until recently, the biggest destroyer of jobs is the volatility of capital itself. It's 4 major crises, it's 4 major recessions. The total number of production and non-supervisory jobs in manufacturing that were destroyed were 7 million. That's actually more than the net loss of jobs, so that somewhere some 870,000 jobs were returned. But why weren't more returned? In the old days, the glorious days or whatever, when the recession was over, most of the jobs came back. Well, they're not coming back. Yes, imports and offshoring are a part of the story. I wouldn't deny that at all. But I also think, and here we might have some differences, that productivity plays a role in this. Now, whether you think the productivity figures and the growth figures of manufacturing and so forth are exaggerated, which I see is in Matthew's book, but using, I think, the kind of thing that Susan Hausman and some others like that have argued. I've actually argued against that in Capital and Class a couple of years ago, but never mind. Nonetheless, if you look at individual industries, the level of productivity running maybe about 3% on average before the Great Recession, 2008 and so forth, is sufficient to explain some of the reason why these jobs don't come back. Well, where does this productivity come from? Yes, partly it's technology, but technology is not neutral. Anybody who knows what goes on in the workplaces, not just in manufacturing, but in the workplaces increasingly around the world, not just in the United States, or even just in the West for that matter. Certainly this goes on in China, that the introduction of, in different decades, of new kinds of ways of creating work intensification, of getting rid of workers without getting rid of as much production and so forth. A way, of course, of doing this, raising the inequality of income, of moving income up from the workers to the employers and so on, globally as well as domestically, have lied in a number of things. And I just want to look at some of these. Beginning in the 80s, in the early part of the neoliberal period, the big recession, double dip recession of 1980 through 82, following that, American capital adopted the Japanese style lean production. The Toyota system is one version of it. Lean production meant a fundamental change in the way that manufacturing work was done. And I'm sure enough of you are familiar with this that I'm not going to go into detail about it, and don't have time to anyway. We call it management by stress. That is, the idea is you keep stressing out the work, you know, and you can get rid of workers and produce the same amount. It's officially called continuous improvement, but management by stress was our word for it. Along with that went an ideological.
Hey, 梅，你说。
Pardon? Along with that went an ideological.
这是我的那个，给我1分钟好吗？任务。
Offensive, which was the labor management cooperation programs that went with lean production in the United States, and these drew the labor leadership, the trade union leadership, into cooperation with management with the lean production methods that unquestionably cost millions of jobs over this long period of time. So that was an important thing. Along with that came deregulation. And here come the containers that were mentioned earlier. Here comes the opening of global supply chains to a degree that was unthinkable before. And the acceleration of speed, just-in-time delivery, is not only an important part of lean production, but also a growing part of global supply chains allowed by deregulation in the United States and elsewhere of transportation primarily, the rise of the container, and increasingly speed as a means of competition, the speed of moving products from production to the market and so forth, what we call logistics. I'll get to that in a minute. The 90s took this system and spread it from manufacturing. It started in the automobile industry in the 80s, but it spread to manufacturing fairly rapidly. By the end of the 90s, this system was operating in hospitals, in schools. You could find it on almost any type of work in the United States and many other places. At the same time, in the US in particular, in this case, there was a dramatic reorganization of supply chains. The creation of a tier system. Remember, before this, most supply chains were arm's length relationships between companies. That was changed in the 90s in particular, and it's still going on, by the introduction of a tier system. What I mean by that is the final manufacturer, whether it was a car plant or General Electric or maker of refrigerators, whatever the assembly end was, would look to its major suppliers as the first tier and demand essentially that they organize the second tier and the third tier and so forth. Remember that even into the 90s, most big producers, the auto producers and consumer good producers, had no idea of what their supply chains looked like. They had no technology to do this or anything like that. So they attempted in the 90s to reorganize that. That meant the destruction of hundreds of thousands of jobs as suppliers were reorganized, concentrated, and themselves now put under lean production, just-in-time norms and so forth. So more and more jobs, lower wages the farther down you go the supply chain. All this is pretty well known. Okay, that's I think important. Logistics in this period become essentially part of production. We can no longer think of things like transportation, warehousing, et cetera, as something separate from the production of not only goods, but services as well. And I could expand on that if needed, but I think it's fairly well known. The 2000s brought at least two more changes that are fundamental in both eliminating certain kinds of jobs, but intensifying and reorganizing work, often on an almost constant basis. So at the level of stress, as well as inequality, economic inequality, the level of stress and psychological damage to working people has accelerated. And there endless polls that demonstrate that fact. So logistics became a science. I mean, it had been a discipline for a long time. By the year 2000, they developed what they call not only supply chain management, but supply chain risk management. Of course, what turns out, the tighter you make the supply chain, the more vulnerable it is to anything, to tsunamis, to bad rain, to strikes, for example. Although that's fairly rare in the US, it does happen now and then. In the 2000s, the two big changes were the transformation of the warehouse from a place of storage to a place of movement. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually very important to the way things are produced, and it has everything in the world to do with trade and the movement of goods internationally. You look at what happened with the supply chain crisis and the pandemic crisis, and you can see, how this works, how if one thing goes wrong, the labor shortage of truckers or something like that, everything goes wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you please start concluding?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. The second transformation, of course, has to do with technology. The laying now of fiber optic cable, the development of data centers, the development of what's called the Internet of Things, with the things being all these nodes in the production of goods and services that are now tied together by this system and now guided electronically. And finally, just surveillance and algorithmic driven work, which is Amazon is the example of this, but it's more and more general all the time. So finally, I was going to go into a little bit about the resistance to this, but maybe we can do that later. Just to conclude, to say that all of this has meant an enormous transformation under these international pressures, to be sure, but an enormous transformation that is part of why income has moved from the vast majority of people up to the 1% and so on. Thank you. Sorry for going on so long.
Thank you, Kim. I think maybe as a first step, I see there are a few people who want to intervene from the floor, and if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you're very welcome to raise your hand or write it in the chat. Maybe, I don't know if Matthew and the rest of the panel wants to just get back to the discussants just to start, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, there's obviously a lot of comments, and I'm not going to hit everything, but a few points. One, just trying to go in order. Adam Tooze is someone we actually reviewed early drafts of the book, and in fact promoted very eagerly. I don't think his thesis is at all inconsistent with what we wrote. I also don't think that what Bernanke wrote about and what we wrote about, I think, are very different things. I don't want to get too much in the macro. I've written about this before in different places. Essentially, the way of, and we also cited Michael Kumhoff in our own book. So again, I don't think these are inconsistent arguments at all, interpretations. The way of looking at this is that globally, there is a transfer of income and spending power from people who buy goods and services to entities that generally are more likely to buy financial assets. Globally, that means that either you have some combination of reduced demand, which means that's going to put pressure on jobs and employment and production, and increased borrowing. How those two forces play out across countries can vary. That leads to differences in trade and all sorts of other problems, but that's globally what the problem was. That was essentially the driver of the financial crisis and really the aftermath of the financial crisis that we've experienced, really arguably beginning in sort of 2000 and sort of continuing on since then. That's what happened in the 1920s. It's what happened towards the period, basically in the lead up in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So I think that's really sort of important to have kind of this broad focus on this. These are what the drivers were. That's what our thesis is. I think the distinction also between consumption and investment is not very useful. We write about this extensively in the book, as well as the other points I made. What classifies as one or the other is really, in some cases, only possible in retrospect and not helpful. What matters is total spending. And that's really where I think it's important. If you look at, for example, in Germany, you have big declines in both consumer spending and in business investment. So I think, focusing too much on these things is really going to get you off the mark. I really appreciate the comments from Ngai Poon about, the sort of specific reforms in China and their scope of what they can achieve. And I think it's absolutely, I mean, one thing I think we've seen a lot in just looking at the pandemic, and we mentioned this sort of briefly in the preface to the paperback edition, is that you can see in China that the precarity of so many workers and the lack of formal ties of many workers to employers, and therefore their lack of participation in the social insurance system that exists in China, means that even if there is, for example, an unemployment insurance system in China, if 80% of people aren't actually able to participate in it, then you have a situation where tens of millions of people during the at least early stages of the pandemic, when they lose their jobs, they have to go back to the countryside. I think my understanding is many of those people have since returned to the cities, but that's the kind of, there's clearly a lot of things that can be done, in more thorough granular analysis of exactly, what reforms would be most helpful is certainly, I mean, that's quite frankly beyond the scope of what we were trying to do, but I think it's definitely valuable and worth doing for others. I think looking at the context of, I think in general, just thinking again about what several panelists made, when we look at trade and financial crises and so forth, as these are symptoms, I think, of sort of the broader economic macro trends we talk about in terms of change in the distribution of income. I don't think it's right to say that trade causes something, or that the expansion of finance causes something. It's more that these are how the systems we have that connect people globally react to these more fundamental changes of the change of distribution of income and spending power. And so I think that it's understandable, for example, for say American trade unionists to say, oh, trade with China is bad. I think it's wrong to say that trade with China is bad, but I can understand why they might say, and I think it would be reasonable to say, in fact, that policies by the Chinese government, by the Chinese party state, have harmed people in the United States as a consequence of the impact they've had on people in China by reducing consumer spending in China and by reducing the labor share, the labor bargaining power of people in China. I think that is an important distinction, and thinking through, how those forces play out. I guess the last point I want to make, I know there's a lot of things to cover here, but obviously, if we're looking at what causes job losses, productivity improvements are a role there. I think that should be welcomed. A lot of productivity improves for jobs that are unpleasant. The reason, people talk about, sometimes, at least in the United States, probably in other places as well, nostalgia for, say, coal mining jobs. But coal mining jobs were a route to early death from black lung disease. Getting rid of those jobs is not a bad thing. What you want to do is have a situation where people can get different, better jobs when those, those unpleasant jobs are replaced. The reason I think the easiest way, I think, to sort of disentangle the productivity versus trade or other things is just look at what is the value of what's produced. And this is where I think, looking at the data is very helpful. And we talk about this in the book, that particularly in the United States, what you can see is that the value of manufacturing production basically stagnated since 2000, and in many cases went down. And this is at a period when the demand domestically in the United States for those same items went up. And it's a period when the trade deficit rose, largely through a mixture of relatively weak export growth and very strong import growth. Now, again, I'm not saying that imports are inherently problematic or that trade is bad, but I think it's very clear that we can link those things together and explain, how those create financial and economic problems for people in the United States. But also, as I said, how they reflect problems elsewhere. Because if exports had grown more, if demand in the rest of the world, if living standards in the rest of the world had grown faster, then that wouldn't have been an issue. And this is the point we make in the book, that if you contrast, say, the 1990s with the 2000s, you can see this very clearly. The 1990s were a period in the US when the trade deficit expanded and manufacturing imports rose rapidly. But manufacturing employment, manufacturing production also, well, manufacturing employment was flat, manufacturing production rose. And that's because it's a period when the rest of the world was doing well and when living standards in the rest of the world were rising rapidly. In the 2000s, you have a different situation where living standards are rising, but they're rising less than production, because essentially you're having a massive transfer away from workers to elites of various forms. And so I think this is, again, I think having this sort of macro conception of how these pieces fit together is very helpful. And we do really lay it out in the book. So I encourage everyone to sort of closely read the whole thing. We have charts and all of that. So hopefully, if you find this discussion interesting, it'll encourage you to take your copy and thumb through all the pages. I know it can be dense. We tried to make it a brisk read. So that's what I have for now. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I see there are a few people who want to ask a question. They're also clapping right now silently. So the first person I'd like to call is Björk, then Lidin. Then I see there was Michael Roberts who wrote some comments. Maybe he wants to ask again or make a contribution. And then I'll call well, there is Fu Wong, Alex, and Rupert Waldron. I'll see, depending on the questions. Okay, please, Björk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these contributions. So one thing I'd really like the panelists to address is talking about worker struggle and actual achievements in limiting exploitation. So looking at how workers' struggle in the US and China at specific moments have changed the distribution of value between workers and capital, and how this has, generated certain responses by the capitalist classes, such as technological advancement, increase in productivity, relocation of factories, and how these domestic changes will impact the global economy and the competition between the US and China. So basically centering worker struggle.
Okay, a more worker-centered reflection on the class struggle. That's a good question. Thank you, Björk. Michael, Bob, are you there? Michael Robert?
Oh, yes.
Yes, thanks.
Right, I just had I don't know if you saw in the chat, everybody, but if you did, I'll just, a couple of questions really for Matthew, I suppose, but other people may have a view on it. Reading the book, I had a couple of quotes that I dug out, which sprung to my mind quite strongly. The book says, trade war is often presented as a war between countries. It is not. It's a conflict mainly between bankers and owners of financial assets on one side and ordinary households on the other, between the very rich and everyone else. Well, okay, so it's not. Class war is no longer a struggle between capital and labor. Things have changed. Perhaps Matthew might like to comment on whether he sees that the old hoary Marxist class struggle position of capital versus labor is no longer relevant in the modern 21st century global situation. And the other quote was in the book, we don't argue that we're in an inevitable crisis of capitalism, but rather that the problems we face can be solved using the kinds of redistributional tools that policymakers have used in the past. I take that to mean that we can first of all solve the major problems of capitalism as you see it at the moment by correct policies which redistribute the relationship, say, between wages and profits, or wages and credit gains, or whatever, but certainly not by anything like replacing capitalism with what we might consider to be socialism and removing the profit motives and the struggle. A contradiction exists between capitalism's striving for profit rather than for people's needs. So these seem to be two fundamental things that I noticed in the book. The class war, as we Marxists would understand it, is now irrelevant and outdated. And secondly, we don't need to replace capitalism. We just need to adjust it a bit on its redistribution spread at the moment with policies that have been well known in the past, presumably Keynes's.
Okay, thank you. Shall we collect another question and then ask the panel to get back to these questions? So Fu Wang, do you want to go next?
Yes, I want to say that it's the second woman speaker, Ngai, who has come to this forum to address us with a book in one hand and a gun in the other. And on the subject of guns, I want to say that trade is not always equal, because the opium trade was directly a reason to transfer resources from China to Britain. And today, China is much stronger. And in this world of competitive capitalisms, I just want to touch on this briefly. I think that we should oppose any attempt by Biden or Trump or NATO to humiliate the Chinese government. We should oppose that. And I mean, I welcome the fact that David Harvey turned around and said in 2008, whether it's true or not economically, he said that China rescued, America, which is very nice from saying the usual, America rescues the world. But nevertheless, what we should oppose, Biden and Trump attempting to humiliate China, I think also there's nothing wrong with Chinese workers humiliating the Chinese government. And we should remember too, that the extradition bill was stopped. We were successful in the extradition bill. And here I learned from Poon Ngai. Poon Ngai said that in 2009, Beijing students and Beijing workers had gotten out, they had come out of the shadow of Tiananmen and united to demonstrate construction workers. And I want to touch also on what Poon Ngai said. I think Poon Ngai was a little bit optimistic. And she touched upon the successful struggles by Yale workers when 20,000 migrant workers struck. And again, Harvard Kennedy says there are 40,000 incidents of protests a year in China. And despite that, the Chinese Communist Party enjoys high legitimacy. And there are many, many of those class struggles and strikes and protests have been successful. Poon Ngai, I think, was very nice when she connected two things. She looked at the students who have moved from the old Maoist adage of to the countryside, to the villages. They have moved directly to say to the enterprises, to the factories, and they went to Jetset. And Poon Ngai said that she looked at these students and the struggles in China by workers as some kind of May 4th, a rejuvenation of May 4th, where the pressures of international capitalism actually impacted and affected the struggles within China itself. So for both the speakers, we would like to touch on that how this has created more thinking in China in terms of responding to, what is changing.
Thank you. Yes, does the panel want to get back to or try to respond to these questions? Who wants to start first?
Maybe I can just take some of the first crack because about the things about the book anyway. I think first of all, we did actually mention the Jetset episode briefly, and I think it's worth pointing out that the students were arrested as a consequence of that, and that they were punished pretty severely by their government, despite essentially being, model students at one of China's top universities. And I think that reflects the challenges that this, that it's not simply that governments really globally are really involved in this. In terms of the questions we got from Michael Roberts, I think that is, I'm glad he highlights this because, this is, we are not Marxists. I know this is a Marxist seminar we're invited to talk about, but I think, as I mentioned, I think Keynes's analysis is probably the most useful here, and that, the reason we make the distinctions that we do is I think it's more useful. What counts as, first of all, there are a lot of people who arguably are neither capital nor labor in any modern society. And also that, a lot of people, they're a little bit of both, or I mean, predominantly one or the other, but, and so, it's not really, I think using those kinds of terms is not really helpful for describing the actual mechanics. And that's why we use the words that we do for, explaining, the dynamics that we've seen and the actual historical events. I think it's also worth stressing, and I realize I probably should mention this earlier, but especially in light of some of the comments we've gotten in some of the panel discussions, I think a lot of the distinction that we have between, this is a capitalist system and this is a communist or socialist system is really overdone. Obviously, there are a lot of differences between them. If you can ask people who live in them what they think, but in terms of the sort of the macro impact, in terms of the phenomena that we're talking about, in terms of whether you have a tendency to, harm workers or deprive people of the ability to, actually enjoy this, what they produce or not, you don't really see kind of clear distinctions between these. I mean, it really what matters much more is the distribution of political and economic power, how dispersed or concentrated it is. And I think that's really, that's actually, I think, the biggest difference between, if we're thinking about how different societies interact with the rest of the world in terms of their, their economic footprint in terms of trade and finance and contribution to, global crisis. I mean, one of the points we make in the book, and I think it's really interesting to look through this, is if you look at the period of Soviet Union's industrialization under Stalin, that's a period where you have massive amounts of redistribution from people in the countryside and in the cities and in the slave labor camps to essentially the creation of state power and investment. And in some, it's a situation where the consumer spending share is absolutely crushed in order to support more investment heavy industry. And you can argue that that was a successful transformation insofar as the Soviet Union does radically transform from being very agrarian to being an industrial power by the 1940s. But that is what happened, and that had significant consequences for the structure of Soviet society. And you can see other societies that tried to do things like that at later points, seeing how that model worked. I think comparing, for example, what's the way the Chinese economy has developed since 1978 to now. I think however you describe the nature of the Chinese government versus other governments, I mean, it's clear that, or what the nature of the Chinese economy is, that the shift from a system where in the 1980s, more than half of the value of what the Chinese economy produces is consumed by ordinary people in China, to a situation where it's something like a third, which is extraordinarily low. You don't see that anywhere outside of, small oil states when the oil price is high, or tax havens. And in both those cases, those are not representative. In large diversified economies like China, you do not see situations where that low of a share is consumed by households. That reflects a whole host of institutions, political economy institutions, deliberately created to transfer economic power from ordinary people to a concentrated group. There's a really interesting book that came out, I think it was in 2008 or 2009, called The Party by Richard McGregor, and he's looking at more from political side than economic side, but I mean, I think it's very helpful for understanding this dynamic, which is the view that the group in charge, however you define it, has to be economically dominant, because having rival economic centers of power is dangerous. That explains, I think, much more of what's happened in China over the past 30 plus years than many other models one might have about the development of capitalism or neoliberalism or what have you. And I think that's really a very helpful framing for seeing this. And obviously we've seen inequality rise in many societies over this period. But if we're looking at how the inequality is translated into consumer spending versus excess production versus borrowing, all these big macro forces we talk about in the book, I think it's very helpful for having this kind of a perspective. And I think of it as being a non-ideological perspective, although maybe that, I'm sure others listening to this might disagree, but I think it's really just sort of like, let's break down what actually, instead of using labels that can potentially color our thinking, such as capitalism or communism, like, let's look at the dynamics of who actually has money, who is spending, who is borrowing, how is this being distributed, and then looking at how those consequences flow through to different parts of a given society and across societies, because ultimately we are all connected. Unless you're living, it's basically, you cannot escape these forces whether you want to or not, unless you maybe if you're a hunter-gathering society somewhere very far removed from the rest of the world. But otherwise, we're all influenced by these things whether we choose to or not. I think it's really important to grasp that, no matter how we characterize our own society or system.
Okay, thanks. Ngai, and
just to save time, I just have two quick points to respond. One point is really regarding how we understand the Jetset incidents, and also how we understand what the students in China, they really try to work closely with the working class and try to address the global rising social inequality issues. And if we really recognize that, then we should say that the Chinese government should apologize to the arrested students because they are doing nothing wrong. So if we recognize that the student working closely with the workers attempted to address the class wars issues, then obviously, this is driven by the fact that China is already part of the global capitalist system. No matter, we would like to recognize it or not. And if we try to understand China is part of the global capitalism society, then which means that within that context, we try to a little bit, conceptualize the current forms of development model as a kind of infrastructure capitalism. So which means that infrastructure capitalism creating a lot more contradictions and a lot more crises within China as well as outside China. So the problem is not only, obviously, it's not a single country problem. So I agree to all of the panelists here that the problem is already a global issue. So from this global issue, when we try to address how we can really contextualize the workers' movement issues, or how could we really mobilize the workers' movement, I think I would say that at least there's two very grand work we need to do. One is that we talk a lot about the movement, but less and less people, they really get involved in doing either organizing in the community level or the trade union in the industry level. So I'm trying to say that doing groundwork is much more important if we really would like to just the workers of the world unite. So this is the first point. The second point is that how could we really connect the groundwork with a transnational context? If we take the Apple producer Foxconn as example, then obviously Foxconn is not only produced inside China. Foxconn produce Apple phones, in India, in Mexico, in East Europe, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic. So whether the workers that work within the global supply chain, they have the attempt to unite together and launch certain kind of campaign and target the transnational company. This is another possible ways, another very grand way we should try. But to me, both sides, obviously they look difficult, but both sides need a lot more energy and a lot more people that are willing to commit to those directions. So once we can connect the very grand local organizing issues with the transnational context of organizing, connecting the global supply chain. All together, these two forces connect maybe one of the potential to address the global rising inequality issues. So just let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cui?
Okay. So maybe I just simply to say that I'm definitely for the bigger protection, more protection for workers' rights and the abolishment of hukou system, definitely for that. However, the reason I didn't mention these issues is that because I think the particular contribution of this book by Pettis and Klein is that, they are trying to say more and integrate this workers' right protection issue in a global interactive framework. And in other words, maybe one implication from their work, according to me, is that to give more rights to the workers, to abolish hukou system is not only right thing to do, not only the right in themselves, but also has the benefit of being good, had a good effect for domestic as well as international economy. So that's why I try to basically agree with the book's agreement, but main thesis, but I try to push forward the explanatory framework. For example, I think even in Matthew's response, it's still not very clear to me. Like, for example, he said their book said this Bank of England economist Comhoff, but that's their early work, but not their new paper, which they challenge saving glut theory explicitly. And but more importantly, I think the theoretical issue is this, because I think their book is plenary, is based on the accounting identity. But this accounting identity is very imaginative, I mean, very suggestive, can help us to think. Because they always have, like, in order to keep this identity, three possibilities or four possibilities we have to consider. However, I think Keynes' revolution is more than accounting identity. For example, Keynes emphasizes saving must equal to investment, exposed rather than ex ante. So the causal relationship is really matters. So I think it's not enough, even, I mean, to just focus on the accounting identities. So that's why, I don't get me wrong, I very much like the book, but I want to push further. Maybe this could be our joint collective effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Kim, did you want to respond to the two questions, or? Kim? Let me see, I don't think I'm seeing you. Okay, so, well, maybe Kim will reappear. In the meantime, I had a few people who wanted to ask questions. There was Alex Kallinicus, then we had Rupert Waldron, John Narayan, and Dave Barry. Alex, can I ask you to be quite brief so we can have another round of answers before we leave? Please.
Yes, I'll do my best to be brief. Matthew, it's a great book. I learned a lot from it, as I did from Michael Pettis's earlier book on the great rebalancing and so on. I wanted to say something though about what you said about the lack of utility of labeling societies as communist or capitalist or whatever. And I think that the point is that it isn't a matter of labeling. It's to do with trying to understand the dynamics of what's going on. So you describe very well the way in which China's extraordinary economic success has depended upon squeezing consumption, and you compared it with what happened to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, I just want to put the Soviet case in a box for a minute, because I think there's a very significant difference between the two cases, which is that apart from the fact that this squeeze went along with a rise in living standards for a lot of people in China, which wasn't true in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the success of the Chinese model is in the context of its integration in the global economic system. And I think Poon Ngai therefore put her finger on it when she said China is part of the global capitalist system. What we have is this squeeze in consumption, which takes place in the context of China becoming in lots of ways, the dynamo of global capitalism. And where your book is particularly illuminating is looking at the interrelationships between between China and also Germany and other parts of the world economy, particularly the United States. I just finish by saying that one of the oddities, I think, of your analysis is that you present the US as, in a certain sense, a victim of what's happening, because the US is a deficit country where financial assets are concentrated, is a loser in this game. But I think from the point of view, and this is particularly so you emphasize with respect to the role of the dollar as reserve currency, but from the point of view of the American elites, the big banks and corporations and so on, I don't think they see that as a problem at all. They benefit from the globalization of industrial production, what's happened in China, and so on and so forth. They may worry about the kind of geopolitical challenge China may represent, but from economic point of view, it's been hugely helpful to them, and that's why, you know, Goldman Sachs and so on are desperate to get deeper into Chinese financial markets. And I think, in a sense, this indicates, I mean, I think it relates in ways I can't elaborate with things that Michael Roberts said, that you don't, although it's great the way you frame things in terms of class rather than in terms of conflict between nations, your class analysis doesn't go deep enough. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Rupert?
Thank you. Yes, so I think, again, you know, I also found both the kind of headline, the title, very provocative, and I found much of interest in the book. And at the same time, actually, I was interested by, and I thought in a way, it's that headline statement, trade war, class war, in a sort of provocative way, very useful. Although actually, Professor Poon's point about, of course, the distinctions between them, I think it's also important to remember that, or to think of that. But in a provocative way, it seems like a very useful headline statement. At the same time, I mean, something other speakers have focused on much better than I could. I felt there was some sense, a lack of recognition of class war as having these two sides in a sense, and obviously the potentially therefore solutions that could look somewhat almost paternalistic, as though the capitalists, or as you say, the elites and the state essentially needs to work with the capitalists, would somehow almost out of benevolence make certain alterations. So obviously in a Marxist seminar, one would expect that kind of argument. And though I think my kind of question is related to that, but in a slightly different way, which is in essence, given the significance of the Marxist strand of thinking about imperialism internationally, and not only thinking about it, but resisting it, is so significant. I was interested in a book with that title, giving so little space to that strand, and not least because, of course, in the Chinese context, it was a defining strand of both activity in resisting imperialism and in working within an international context against it. And of course, from the American context, in deliberately in fighting very hard to undermine that possibility of essentially basing a state and an economy in working class agency and the ongoing struggle. So my question would be around whether, out of a sense of completion or something, there could be a further consideration of those implications. Essentially, China's participation in both globalization and therefore the whole, its place in what was started with the containerization, etc. But also, of course, its deep rising inequalities. Surely are so related to its movement to capitalism from a kind of socialist position, of course, recognizing the difficulties of defining them, but recognizing the validity and that obviously of obviously that would take research in itself. What's the point at which one would define a movement to and or from socialism, etc. But to see that this alternative is materially so significant to the subject, and somehow unpack that, whether that would be an important thing to do. That's my question.
Thank you, Robert. John?
Hi, thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for the great conversation that we're all having. I guess I'll build on what Alex was saying in some extent, and that's just simply in the book, which is a great book, there's there's not enough discussion, in my opinion, of imperialism. So there's the distinction between Hobson and Lenin in the book. But in a sense, I guess the question I have to Matthew is, what about imperialism? How does imperialism figure into this? Because America really isn't the victim of the global economy. Its elites have essentially extracted labor, and we can say via the Chinese entering into the system, but from Chinese labor, and brought the surpluses back. And the system works for the US, as Alex says. It has the reserve currency of the world. It's able to create a rentier economy. In a sense, like, isn't this just in capitalism, right? And then this then leads to the other question, which is the policy solutions, which I guess are Keynesian in their kind of foundation. How do they solve this if we take imperialism seriously? So, for example, if we think imperialism is about income deflation of the global South, like the Pataics argue, how do you solve that just with Keynesian tools? Surely you need to do something more radical in order to have actual what we would want as class war, right? So I guess that's the big question here. Are we really saying it's just about imbalances, or is it really about the actual capitalist system itself? I hope that was short enough, Lucio.
Thank you, and sorry, Matthew, but this is indeed a Marxist seminar, so I see a kind of fil rouge in this kind of questions. Last one is Dave Barry.
Yeah, thank you. I think John just said a lot of what my thoughts were, that we are going through a period of economic imperialism, and whether we can find Keynesian solutions is probably not going to happen. Keynes said he was in favor of trade, but only if it was not accompanied by the free movement of capital, because he said in that case it would raise enmities and conflicts and rivalries, and that's actually what we're seeing. And the difficulty for resistance for workers is that the capital can either be moved away from the jobs, or labour can be moved around to increase the rate of exploitation. So with the free movement of capital, resistance is extremely difficult. To me, go back to Fu Wang's point that we end up, workers can either be worked to death or resistance through the guns. So we return to revolution. So it is just what was national capitalism now playing out on a global scale. And of course, many workers will revert to national boundaries to try and protect themselves from global capital.
Thanks, Dave. So I suggest we have, so I see some people have left, but many have stayed, and surely they are interested in this debate. So thanks everyone for your questions, and unless there is anyone else who wants to quickly intervene. Joseph, Bjork, Joseph Chunara. Okay. Then I think we could, well, actually, maybe we could have Matthew last, or no, Matthew first, maybe. So, and then I'll call the rest of the panel. So Matthew, do you want to get back to some of these questions? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and I'm not going to be able to hit all of it, but I think the reason that, we talk about things the way we do. And I mean, first of all, I would completely agree that there are people in the US who have benefited tremendously from the developments that we've seen. In fact, that's consistent with the thesis of the book, which is that thinking of countries as the unit of analysis is not very helpful for understanding what's happened. And sometimes one thing we've seen is that we get pushback from people who they like to agree with that and then say, but the US is the villain, which is not very helpful. I mean, the whole point of the book is that most people in most countries globally have been at the losing end of this, and some people across countries globally have been have been the big beneficiaries. So I completely agree with that. I think that the way we phrase it is sort of relating it back to sort of the Hobsonian explanation of imperialism, of which societies are sort of the subject states versus the core, that using that framing, which I think is a helpful framing for understanding the nature of imbalances and the directions of excess production and versus excess debt or whatever, that using that model, which we talk about in the book a bit in the beginning, from that perspective, that the US and for that matter the other English speaking advanced economies are basically in the role of the imperial subject states in terms of the sort of the economic role they play in the global system, even if it's also the case that there are elites within those societies that have prospered as a consequence and maybe even have been active participants in the shaping of that system. And so I think that's I think the sort of helpful framing of it, and obviously the importance of U.S. Financiers and particularly the financial elite, but also other business elites in shaping this and participating in this is very helpful. But it's helpful for understanding the dynamic. But at the same time, if we think about what was the role that imperial subject states played in the late 19th century for absorbing the excess production that existed in Western Europe, and that excess production was a consequence of the fact that workers in Western Europe in the late 19th century were underpaid and therefore couldn't afford to buy what was being produced there, and so the owners there had an incentive to find new markets and essentially lent money elsewhere. Again, from that model, that the countries fitting that description are much more like China, Japan, Germany, rather than the US. That's the reason we talk about this. I would certainly not want to say that no Americans are benefiting from this, even if most Americans, I think, are worse off. Just as some Chinese are benefiting tremendously from it, many Chinese are worse off than they otherwise would have been. Hopefully that addresses that set of questions. I mean, I think on the question of crisis of capitalism or not, again, I think the reason I don't think this represents a fundamental crisis of capitalism, the reason why I'm confident that sort of the traditional Keynesian remedies are still useful is because they did work. We saw this a long period in which these issues were not at the forefront, and that's the period when we did have, on the one hand, limits on financial flows between countries, which prevented the kinds of massive amounts of cross-border borrowing and lending, and also internal borrowing and lending, because it's not, thinking of national borders as being really important for this, I think misses the mark. I think the synthesis of sort of the banking glut versus savings. I mean, I don't like the Bernanke thesis, so I don't want to confuse people, but I think the synthesis here is that if you have a massive inequalities that have to be reconciled through large amounts of lending and borrowing. And again, if this sounds complex, we talk about it a lot more in the book. I don't want to bore you all with these details, but some of that's going to occur across borders. Some of it's going to be internal. And those are the kinds of but we know how to deal with that. We don't need to have a radical revolution in politics or sort of over economic system. And we just need to we have tools for dealing with, as I said, Keynes basically talked about. So you have some more redistribution of income through the tax system. You have some different regulation of financial sector. Have different policies toward unions. Part of the reason I'm sort of optimistic, at least in the West, that we can use these kinds of tools we used in the past is because we saw very clearly that when we stopped doing these things or we changed specific policies, starting in the 80s and accelerating to the 90s, what the changes were. So all you have to do is just undo that in many ways, and I think you'd be and a very good, that would be helpful a lot. Obviously, in other societies that have sort of a different background, China most obviously, but you have to have different kind of prescription based on their own circumstances. But I think that's the reason why I am relatively, whether it can happen is a different question, but I'm relatively optimistic that it could happen. And I think that and just following up on why I don't think we need to have a complete, overthrow of the system is that it might not be intuitive to a lot of the existing elites, but in many ways, this would actually be beneficial to them if they sort of had a more broad-minded view. And again, this is sort of the Keynesian insight, which is that the global economy as a whole has been much weaker than it otherwise would have been. And maybe they have a larger share of a smaller pie, now than they otherwise would. But the kinds of changes that we're talking about would lead to a much bigger global economy. And so even if they had a smaller share of a larger pie, we've seen that there are many people who don't support this, even with sort of this knowledge, but it doesn't have to be, again, thinking, at the very basic level, what's the thesis of the book? It's that zero-sum thinking is wrong. It's wrong in terms of the context of, who wins and loses from trade. It's wrong there. Our analysis of the global economy, and again, if you want to sort of go through the details of the argument and some of the mechanics, some of which is, I confess, complex, but it's laid out in the book, so I encourage you to kind of go through the details. But hopefully that sort of gets at the big points here and why we have the sort of come to the kinds of conclusions that we do. So thank you.
Thank you. Kim, you're back. Do you want to join us for some final remarks?
Well, okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I got cut off. I have no idea why. My computer just suddenly said it had no internet, which is ridiculous. But at any rate, let me just conclude by saying that my framework is more towards those who have had a class analysis in the more Marxist traditional way, and who see this capitalism in crisis, not necessarily in a terminal one by any means, but certainly in a crisis. But even if we look at some of the reforms and the ideas of income redistribution, the Green New Deal, whatever kind of thing you want to talk about, the problem always comes back to not can we have the best policy, because policies, we can come up with these policies, and indeed Matthew in the book have some, important policies and so on, other people. The question is, how do we get them? We look at the United States, politics in the United States, we have a choice between Trump and Biden. Biden had some ideas of moderate kind of thing, of some redistribution, and that's dead, practically. Killed by who? Not even by the Republicans, killed by his own right wing in his party. And so you have a situation where if we're looking for even reforms in this era, we have to ask, can we get these with what we have politically now? And I think the answer to that is no, we can't. We have to have some way of thinking of a new political force based, I would say, on the working class, which of course today is in many ways a very different working class than it was 100 years ago. When Hobson or Lenin or whoever you want to quote on imperialism. But still it is a working class that produces this wealth that is maldistributed and so forth, and that has some kind of power by virtue of its position in the economy, not just its numbers, but its position at the point of production in goods and services, transportation, whatever you want to name. But it's not organized to do this right now. And so I think the question for those of us who have a socialist perspective on this, even in the fight for reforms, which I doubt if many of us reject the value of doing that, is how do we rebuild, a kind of working class movement? The traditional social democratic parties, communist parties have all basically turned out to be worthless. Have all gone, at least in the West, certainly into neoliberalism and so forth. So we're back at a starting point. And so I think that it's great to write books on policy. It's absolutely essential to write books on policy and macro analysis and all of that. But we also have to think, how do we connect some of these things, some of these analytical ideas, with what we see going on at a basic level? How do things like Black Lives Matter fit into this picture? Do they fit into this picture? Well, I think they do very much. How do things like, there's a kind of slight uptick in strike activity in the United States. I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's something we haven't seen for 20, 30, 40 years. And I believe we're at an economic conjuncture, high inflation, low unemployment. This is kind of a classic set for more strike activity and so on. How do we, is there something there, or is just this the same old thing that doesn't matter? I think these are questions we have to ask as well.
Thank you so much, Kim. Cui?
Okay, actually, I don't have much more to say.
Fine.
I just want to thank you for everyone, especially my friend Lin Chun, for introducing me to this great seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Lin Chun, as well. I don't know, Lin, if you're around, you want to say a few words. And finally, Ngai, do you want to say a few words to conclude? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I'm actually very happy to hear, the heated debates here. I really learned a lot. And I would like to try to, re-emphasize that the beauty of this book is really try to let everybody understand that trade war is not really conflict between countries. Trade war is actually, class war. And specifically, Matthew and Michael try to let us know that most of the American company, especially, the biggest one, they never fully pay their tax. So which means that they never contributed to the social redistribution of wealth and try to support the working class within the USA society. That is the social conditioning. To me, there's the social conditioning that the working class in the United States can work closely with the Chinese working class together because, they have the same enemy. They're under the same umbrella of the global capitalism. That is the beauty part of this book. But I really have the problem with this book is that even though you already identify the trade problem as class problem, but it looked like you didn't really take it seriously. Take the class issue seriously as, Alex, John, and others have point out here. To me, I would like to put a little bit further that how if we didn't take the class war seriously, that means that all the prescription you offer is not, it couldn't really attach, couldn't really address those issues, especially when the global capitalism really reached the point of, high stage of imperialism. And if the high stage of imperialism, one more step is totalitarianism. So the trade war can turn into physical war. And the physical war is, to me, if you are in Hong Kong, you're in Taiwan, you can imagine, that is not that far away. So are we going to address those issues? How the trade war as class war can respond to the most urgent issues, in the region I live. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for this great panel this evening or this morning. And thanks also to Ngai Poon and to for staying awake so late, because I think it's almost 2 a.m. probably in the morning. So thanks so much for this. And if you subscribe to our mailing list, you receive more information about our next seminars. And thanks, Matthew, for your patience. And I hope this wasn't too Marxist, a seminar for you. Anyway, thanks everyone and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.